4 structures that went to war with the sea. An airport that has been sinking since the day it was born. A bridge an earthquake made longer. A tunnel dug under the ocean floor. And a road that dives beneath the waves. All 4. Back to back. There is an airport in Japan that has been sinking since the day it opened. Not slowly cracking, sinking. Its artificial island has dropped more than 13 meters into the sea. And here's the strange part. The engineers who built it knew this would happen. They planned for it. This is the story of a building designed to lose a fight with the ocean, slowly, for the rest of its life. This is Kansai International Airport. It sits on a man-made island in Osaka Bay, a few kilometers off the coast of Japan. It was meant to solve an impossible problem. And to do that, engineers had to build something that had never really been tried at this scale. An airport floating on soft mud in the open sea. The problem was space. By the 1980s, the Osaka region was one of the busiest in Japan, and it was running out of room. Its existing airport was hemmed in by the city and could not expand or run at night without waking millions of people. There was no empty land left to build on, so Japan made a decision that sounds almost absurd. If there was no land, they would build the land. The plan was to construct an artificial island out in Osaka Bay, far enough from the city that planes could take off and land 24 hours a day. No curfew, no neighbors to disturb. To make that island, crews carved into mountains and moved around 430 million cubic meters of rock and earth. They drove more than 1 million vertical drains down through the soft seabed to try to squeeze the water out of the mud below. On top of that island, they built a terminal designed by the architect Renzo Piano. It stretches for about 1.7 kilometers, one of the longest airport terminals on Earth, a single sweeping roof, curved like a wing. When it opened in September of 1994, Kansai looked like the future, an entire international airport conjured out of the sea. But underneath the marble and the glass, the engineers were already fighting a battle they knew they could not fully win. Because the ground under Osaka Bay is not solid. It is a deep bed of soft clay laid down over thousands of years. Pile a man-made island on top of it, millions of tons of rock, and that clay does what clay does. It compresses, it squeezes down. The island was always going to sink. The engineers knew that. What they did not fully predict was how fast. In its first year, the island sank at a rate of about 50 centimeters, not over a decade, in a single year. It was going down faster than the models had promised, and in places it was sinking unevenly, which is far more dangerous for a giant building than sinking straight down. The airport had opened, planes were landing, and the whole thing was quietly dropping into the bay beneath the passengers' feet. The response to that came on 3 fronts. The first was money. The sinking was the single biggest driver of the airport's spiraling cost. By the time everything was accounted for, Kansai had become one of the most expensive airports ever built, with figures reported in the range of $15 to $20 billion. A huge share of that was the endless work of fighting the settlement. The second front was the engineering itself, and this is where it gets clever. The designers had known the building would sink, so they built it to be adjustable. The entire terminal stands on around 900 massive columns. And at the base of each column sits a stack of thick steel plates. When one part of the building sinks lower than the rest, crews jack up that column and slide another metal plate underneath. Then they lower it back down, level again. Think about what that means. This is not a one-time fix. It is a permanent job. For decades, teams have been going column to column, measuring, lifting, and shimming the airport back to level, one steel plate at a time. The building is not standing still, it is being constantly rebalanced on top of ground that will not stop moving. By 2008, the sink rate had slowed to around 7 centimeters a year, and it has kept slowing since. But it has never stopped. When engineers later added a second island for a new runway, that one began sinking too, and in places faster than expected, because the clay beneath it was even deeper. Today, the total settlement on that second island is measured at over 17 meters since construction began. 17 meters, and as recently as December of 2025, parts of it were still going down around 20 centimeters every year. Then came the third front, not slow physics, but a single violent night. On the 4th of September 2018, exactly 24 years after the airport opened, Typhoon Jebi slammed into western Japan's strongest storm to hit the country in 25 years, with winds over 200 kilometers an hour. The sea surged over Kansai's defenses and flooded a runway and the lower floors of the terminal. Some aircraft sat in water up to their engines. And then it got worse. A 2,500-ton tanker, torn loose by the wind, was driven straight into the only bridge connecting the island to the mainland. The bridge was damaged and partly closed. In an instant, around 3,000 people were trapped on an artificial island in the middle of a typhoon. It took days to get everyone off, and about 2 weeks to fully reopen the airport. GB was a brutal reminder. This airport does not just fight the clay below, it sits low, out in the open sea, as that sea gets more dangerous. So what is Kansai, in the end? It is easy to hear a sinking airport and picture a failure. It is not one. For over 30 years, this island has served as one of Japan's most important airports, running around the clock, connecting the whole Kansai region to the world. Because Kansai was never sold a lie. Its engineers did not promise to beat the sea. They promised to manage it. They built a machine that could be endlessly adjusted, and then committed to adjusting it, forever. The seawalls have been raised since JB. The columns are still being shimmed. The measurements are still being taken, month after month. It is less like a finished building and more like a patient, kept stable by constant care. And that might be the most honest thing about it. Kansai does not pretend the ground is solid. It admits, in steel and concrete, that the sea will keep pulling it down, and it chooses to keep standing anyway. As sea levels rise and storms get stronger, more of the world's coastlines will face that same question. Not how do we stop the water, but how long are we willing to keep lifting and shimming and holding the line? Kansai has been answering that question for 30 years. The real question is how much longer the answer stays yes. They rise perfectly straight, perfectly vertical. And yet, at the top, they stand about 3 inches farther apart than they do at the bottom. The reason? Is almost unbelievable. These towers are so tall and so far apart that they follow the curve of the planet itself. This is the Akashi Kaikyō Bridge, and building it meant fighting the ocean, the wind, and even the earth beneath it. Before we get to how, we have to understand why anyone would attempt something this insane in the first place. The bridge crosses the Akashi Strait, a stretch of water separating the Japanese mainland near Kobe from Awaji Island. For a long time, the only way across was by ferry. But this strait is treacherous, swept by fierce currents, brutal storms, and some of the busiest shipping traffic in the world. And then tragedy forced the issue. Ferries crossing these waters were terribly vulnerable to sudden violent weather, and disaster in the strait pushed Japan to find a permanent, safer link was to build a bridge. But the strait is wide, deep, and constantly moving. A normal bridge was simply out of the question. To cross it, engineers designed a suspension bridge on a scale never seen before. The central span, the distance between the two towers, would stretch 1,991 meters. That is very nearly 2 kilometers of road hanging in open air, with no support underneath at all. For decades, that made it the longest suspension bridge span on Earth, a record it held until 2022. To hold up that impossible middle section, the engineers needed towers of staggering height. Each of the 2 main towers rises 297 meters above the water, taller than almost any building in Japan at the time. But before a single tower could rise, they faced a hidden problem, down in the dark. The foundations for those towers had to be planted on the floor of a deep, fast-moving strait where powerful currents could wash away wet concrete in seconds. So engineers sank enormous hollow steel foundations into the seabed. Then they filled them with a specially developed concrete, designed to set hard underwater without dissolving away in the current. Only once those giant anchoring feet were locked into the seabed could the towers themselves begin to climb toward the sky. And when they did, they revealed something strange about our world. Now think about that tower height and that distance at the same time. The towers are built dead vertical, each one pointing straight up, away from the center of the Earth. But the Earth is a sphere. 2 perfectly vertical towers planted 2 kilometers apart must slowly spread away from each other as they rise. That is why the tops of the towers are about 3 inches farther apart than their bases. It is not a mistake. It is not sloppy construction. It is the shape of our planet, showing up in the measurements of a single bridge. But the towers were only the anchors for the real magic. Next came the cables. A suspension bridge hangs its entire roadway from 2 massive main cables draped over the tops of the towers and locked into the ground at each end. On the Akashi Kaikyō Bridge, each of those cables is more than a meter thick, and each one is not a single rope, but a bundle of tens of thousands of thin steel wires packed tightly together. The numbers are hard to even picture. Each main cable contains over 36,000 individual strands of wire, and if you took all the wire used in the bridge's cables and laid it end to end, it would stretch about 300,000 kilometers. That is enough wire to wrap around the entire planet roughly 7 times. And those cables were not delivered ready-made. They were spun in place, high above the water, wire by wire, ferried back and forth across the strait thousands of times, until the strands built up into a single colossal cable, all of it strung above busy shipping lanes and churning currents without stopping the sea traffic below. At each end of the bridge, those cables are locked into gigantic concrete anchorages, blocks so massive they can resist the constant, enormous pull of the entire hanging roadway. If a cable is the muscle of a suspension bridge, the anchorages are the bones it braces against. And all of this was being built in one of the most earthquake-prone regions on Earth. Which brings us to the moment everything nearly fell apart. In January of 1995, while the towers were standing but the bridge was still unfinished, catastrophe struck. The Great Hanshin earthquake, centered near Kobe, tore through the region. It killed more than 6,000 people and devastated the very city the bridge was being built to serve. The bridge towers were right in the path of that violence. The ground itself shifted. And when the shaking finally stopped and the engineers went to measure their half-built structure, they discovered something astonishing. The earthquake had physically moved the two enormous towers farther apart. The gap between them had grown by more than a full meter. The bridge that had been designed with a central span of 1,990 meters was now 1,991. The planet had reached up and edited the blueprint mid-construction, and yet, incredibly, the towers themselves stood firm. Instead of starting over, the engineers adapted. They adjusted the design to the new, slightly longer span and carried on. To this day, that extra meter is baked into the official length of the bridge, a permanent scar from the day the Earth moved. But earthquakes were not the only enemy waiting for this bridge. This bridge sits in the open ocean, exposed to typhoons that can hurl wind speeds of nearly 300 kilometers per hour. A structure this long and this slender could be shaken apart by wind alone, twisting and swaying until it failed. So before they built it, engineers made a giant-scale model and blasted it with wind in a tunnel, hunting for any flaw. Then they engineered the real bridge to survive. They built the deck to flex and breathe in the wind, and they hid clever weights inside the towers, tuned pendulums that swing to cancel out the wind's push, similar to the giant damper we saw inside Taipei 101. The bridge was made to bend, so that it would never break. After roughly 10 years of construction, the Akashi Kaikyō Bridge finally opened in 1998. A crossing that once meant a slow, sometimes deadly ferry ride now takes only minutes. And what stands there today is not just a road over water. It is a monument to stubborn, brilliant engineering. Think about everything that bridge had to defeat. The width of a treacherous strait, foundations sunk into a deep, racing current, towers so tall the curve of the Earth had to be accounted for, cables holding enough wire to circle the planet 7 times, and an earthquake so powerful it rewrote the bridge's dimensions while it was still being built. The Akashi Kaikyō Bridge is proof that engineering at the highest level is not about ignoring nature. It is about respecting it, planning for it, and bending with it, right down to the shape of the Earth and the trembling of the ground. Some structures are built despite the planet. This one was built in conversation with it. But bridges and towers are not the only place engineers wrestle with forces this big. Somewhere out there, humans dug a tunnel so deep and so long beneath the sea that workers rode for kilometers under the ocean floor just to reach the place where the digging was happening. That is the next story. 240 meters beneath the surface of the sea, a bullet train is slowing down. Above it sit the cold waters of one of the most dangerous straits in Japan. This train was built to move at 320 kilometers an hour. Down here, it is limited to 160. And the reason why is the whole story. This is the Seikan Tunnel. For decades, it was the longest undersea tunnel on Earth. It was meant to be Japan's triumph over the sea, a permanent link between two of its main islands, and the road that would finally carry high-speed rail to the north. That was the promise. What actually happened is stranger, and a lot more human. To understand the ambition, you have to go back to a single, terrible night. In September of 1954, a powerful typhoon tore across the Tsugaru Strait, the stretch of water separating the island of Honshu from the northern island of Hokkaido. At the time, the only way across was by ferry. That night, 5 ferries were caught in the storm. One of them was the Toyamaru. When the typhoon was over, more than 1,400 people were dead. It remains one of the worst maritime disasters in Japanese history, and it changed the way the country thought about that strip of water. The sea had proven, again, that it could not be trusted. Japan decided it needed a link that a storm could never touch. Not a bridge, exposed to the wind. Something deeper. Something the weather could never reach. The plan was staggering. Engineers would dig a railway tunnel clean under the strait, through the seabed itself. When it was finished, the Seikan Tunnel would stretch almost 54 kilometers from end to end. 23 of those kilometers would run beneath the open sea, at the open sea. At its lowest point, the track would sit about 100 meters below the seabed and roughly 240 meters below the waves. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. To dig it, crews first bored a smaller pilot tunnel to map the rock ahead. Then a service tunnel. Then, finally, the main bore for the trains. 3 parallel tunnels, crawling toward each other from both islands, deep under a moving sea. On paper, it was one of the boldest pieces of engineering the world had ever seen. The problem was the ground it had to pass through. The rock under the Tsugaru Strait is not solid granite. It is a broken, fractured mess of volcanic stone cut through with fault lines and soft zones, and all of it soaked in enormous water. Digging through it was less like tunneling and more like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. And on the 4th of May, 1976, the ocean won. A section of the works hit a soft fault zone and the sea broke in. Water poured into the tunnel, faster than the pumps could handle, tens of tons a minute, and floods and kilometers of hard-won excavation. Crews scrambled to seal it off before the project drowns. It took months. They led them to pump the tunnel dry and repair the damage. It was not the first flood, and it would not be the last. Each one asked the same question. Was this tunnel even possible? The answer came at a staggering cost, and it arrived on 3 fronts. The first was money. The Seikan Tunnel was originally budgeted as an expensive but manageable national project. By the time it was finished, the total cost had reached around $7 billion. That was roughly 12 times the original estimate. 12 times. The overruns came from the ground itself. To get through that fractured, waterlogged rock, engineers pioneered a punishing technique. Ahead of the digging, they drilled holes and injected cement grout into the rock, again and again, sealing the fractures before they could leak. Worked, but it was brutally slow. The tunnel advanced through some zones at a crawl, meter by meter, sealing as it went. Which brings us to the second front. The engineering was not just expensive, it was deadly. Across the full construction, the tunnel employed as many as 3,000 workers at a time. Over the years of digging, 34 of them were killed. Cave-ins, floods, accidents in the dark, far out under the sea. Every kilometer of that tunnel was paid for in lives, not just yen. And the digging simply would not end. Surveying had started back in the 1960s. Full construction ran through the 70s and deep into the 80s. In total, from the first serious work to the first train, the Seikan Tunnel took around a quarter of a century to complete. A generation of engineers spent their entire careers underneath that strait. Then came the third front, and this is the one that hurt. Politics and timing. While the tunnel was being dug, the organization building it was falling apart. Japan's national railway had been drowning in debt for years. In 1987, just 1 year before the tunnel opened, that national railway was broken up and privatized. The institution that dreamed up the tunnel barely survived to see it finished. But the deeper problem was the world above the tunnel. It had moved on. When the Seikan Tunnel was conceived in the shadow of a ferry disaster, crossing the strait was slow and dangerous. By the time it finally opened in 1988, that was no longer true. Cheap, fast, domestic flights had appeared, and for a traveler heading from Tokyo to the north, a plane was simply faster. So the tunnel opened to a strange, quiet problem. It was a monumental achievement that very few passengers actually needed. For years, the trains that ran through it were ordinary, slower services. The one thing that might have justified the whole project, a true high-speed line to Hokkaido, did not run through it at all. The bullet train, the reason the tunnel made sense, simply was not there yet. For nearly 3 decades, the greatest undersea tunnel on Earth waited for the trains it was built for, and then in 2016 they finally came. The Hokkaido Shinkansen opened, for the Kansai time learned, and for the first time a bullet train ran under the sea through the Seikan Tunnel. On paper, the dream was complete. In practice, it came with a catch, because the tunnel is still shared. Around 50 freight trains use it every single day, and those slower, narrow-gauge trains cannot be pushed aside. That sharing is why the bullet train slows down. Shinkansen speed pushes a wall of air ahead of it. In the tight space of the tunnel, that shockwave could slam into an oncoming freight train and destabilize it. So inside the Seikan Tunnel, the fastest trains in Japan are held to 160 kilometers an hour. The tunnel that was meant to unleash high-speed rail is the one place it has to hold back. And the passengers still have not really come. As of reporting in the mid-2020s, around 90% of people traveling between Tokyo and Hokkaido still fly. The Tokyo to Sapporo air route is one of the busiest on the planet. The Shinkansen will only truly compete when the line reaches Sapporo itself, and that extension has slipped. Current projections put it near the end of the 2030s. So what is the Seikan Tunnel, really? It is not the failure its critics once predicted. It carries those 50 freight trains a day, quietly moving a huge share of the goods that keep northern Japan supplied, in all weather. No matter what the strait is doing above it. It became an artery. It is not the one it was designed to be. It was built to move people away from a deadly sea. And instead, it ended up moving cargo, a monument to an ambition that history quietly overtook, still doing honest work 240 meters down. Which raises a harder question. When a nation spends a generation and 34 lives to beat the sea, and the world moves on before the work is done, was it a failure or just early? If you drive from Sweden to Denmark, you get onto a bridge over open sea. You drive for about 8 kilometers, high above the water, with nothing on either side. And then the road tilts downwards and disappears into the seabed. Halfway across, the bridge simply stops being a bridge. This was not a compromise. It was the only way the crossing could exist at all. It is called the Oresund crossing. It connects Malmö in Sweden to Copenhagen in Denmark, and it took over a century of arguing to build. This is why the engineers deliberately built 2 entirely different structures and joined them together with an island that did not exist. The Öresund is the strait separating southern Sweden from Denmark. At its narrowest, it is only a few kilometers wide. For centuries, people had stood on one shore looking at the other and taken a ferry. And that ferry was a genuine economic wall. Copenhagen and Malmö are close enough to be a single city region, but a body of water in between changes everything. You cannot casually commute across a strait. Businesses on one side do not hire from the other. 2 labor markets, 2 housing markets, 2 economies, 20 kilometers apart and functionally separate. Proposals to fix it go back to the 1800s. Bridges, tunnels, causeways. None of them happened, for the very ordinary reason that they were enormously expensive and nobody could agree who paid. It was only in 1991 that Sweden and Denmark finally signed an agreement to build a fixed link financed by the tolls it would eventually collect. And the plan they landed on was strange. From the Swedish coast, a cable-stayed bridge carrying a motorway on its upper deck and a railway on the deck below, running just under 8 kilometers out to sea, its pylons rising more than 200 meters. Then, in the middle of the strait, an artificial island, 4 kilometers long, built from scratch out of material dredged from the seabed. And from that island, a tunnel, around 4 kilometers of it, running under the water to the Danish shore. Total crossing, roughly 16 kilometers. So, why not just build a bridge the whole way? The answer is that a bridge across the Danish half would have collided with two things that could not be moved. The first is Copenhagen Airport. It sits on the island of Amager, right at the Danish end of the crossing, and its approach paths run out over exactly the water the bridge would have to cross. A structure with 200-meter pylons standing in the flight path of an international airport is not a negotiation you win. The second is shipping. The Oresund is a working strait, and the Drogden Channel on the Danish side carries vessel traffic in and out of the Baltic. A bridge would need piers in the water and a fixed clearance above it. A tunnel has neither problem. Ships pass over the top and never know it is there. Which is how you end up with the three hardest problems on the project. The first was building the tunnel itself. The Drogden Tunnel is not bored through rock. It is an immersed tube tunnel, which is a genuinely audacious way to build. Enormous concrete sections were cast on land, sealed at both ends, floated out to position, and then deliberately sunk into a trench dredged into the seabed. Each one was lowered, aligned to its neighbor within centimeters, joined, and then the seals were removed to make one continuous tube. Then the whole thing was buried again, 20 sections laid end to end under a shipping lane. The island in the middle exists because of this. You cannot simply transition from a high bridge to a submerged tunnel in open water. You need somewhere for the road and rail to come down, level out, and go under. So they built one. It was named Pepperholm, Pepper Islet, as a joke, because the natural island next to it is called Saltholm, Salt Islet. The second problem was the Baltic Sea itself, and this is the part that most people never hear about. The Baltic is unusual. It is brackish, only partly salty, and it stays that way because of a slow exchange of water through the Danish straits. Interfere with that flow and you change the chemistry of an entire sea, with consequences for fish stocks and ecosystems across several countries. So the project was held to what was called a zero solution. The finished crossing had to allow essentially the same volume of water through the strait as before it was built. Every pier, every meter of artificial island, every bit of the tunnel trench blocked some flow. To compensate, the seabed elsewhere was dredged out to widen the channel and let the same amount of water through. They had to build a 16-kilometer structure across a strait and leave the strait hydrodynamically more or less as they found it. The third problem was inherited from a different century. The seabed of the Oresund had been a war zone. Before dredging could begin, the route had to be surveyed and cleared of unexploded ordnance left over from the Second World War. Bombs were located and removed from the seabed before a single tunnel section could be laid. The crossing opened on the 1st of July, 2000, in a ceremony where the Queen of Denmark and the King of Sweden met in the middle. The reported construction cost was around 19.6 billion Danish kroner, roughly 2.6 billion euros, funded by borrowing against future toll income. And in the early years, it underdelivered. Traffic came in below forecast. Tolls were expensive, habits were slow to change, and for a while the crossing looked like it might be another grand link that nobody used enough to justify. Then something shifted. Housing costs in Copenhagen pushed Danes across the water into cheaper Malmö. Rail service improved. Commuting across a national border stopped being exotic and started being normal. Today, tens of thousands of people cross every day, and the two cities function far more like a single region than they know. And then there is Pebom, which has become the most unexpected thing about the whole project. Instead of landscaping it, the engineers deliberately left the artificial island alone to see what would colonize it on its own. It is now a protected nature reserve closed to the public but monitored by biologists. Hundreds of plant species have arrived by wind, water, and bird. Rare toads breed there. Gulls and geese nest on it. An island made of dredged seabed to solve a road problem has quietly turned into an accidental ecological experiment. So what did Sweden and Denmark actually build? Not really a bridge. They built a compromise, engineered into concrete and steel. A structure that goes high where it needs to be high, disappears where it needs to disappear, hands over the difference on a man-made island, and leaves the sea flowing the way it always did. It is not the most spectacular crossing in the world. It might be one of the most disciplined, which raises a question worth asking about big infrastructure generally. Is the best engineering the kind you notice? Or the kind that quietly refuses to be a problem? If this blew your mind, hit that like button and subscribe for more megastructures. And tell me in the comments which one I should cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.